Today we're going to be talking about the features of the ethically compliant virtual office in New York, and we're also going to check out how some of the virtual office vendors in the New York City marketplace stack up against each other. Hi, my name's Steve Fenari. I'm a practicing corporate attorney with the New York firm of Fenari Scheer, and I'm the founder of a company called Law Firm Suites. We operate shared office spaces exclusively for attorneys, and we rent virtual law offices to close to 200 law firms. The driving force behind virtual office ethics in New York is Judiciary Law 470, which says that all attorneys practicing in New York must have an office for the transaction of law business. For New York residents, that office can be in their homes, but for non-residents, they'd be required to get, at least minimally, a virtual office rental that satisfies Section 470. I talk about Judiciary Law 470, whether or not it's valid law, and suggestions for compliance in a sister video, which you can check out on Law Firm Suite's YouTube channel. In addition to Section 470, lawyers need to be mindful of ethics rules regarding confidentiality, the maintenance of attorney-client privilege, and restrictions on advertising, including false or misleading statements. I built my profile of an ethically compliant virtual law office from three resources: case law, New York State policy statements on the issue, and from formal ethics opinions. So to connect the dots between the three resources, I built two profiles of the ethically compliant virtual office for non-residents, one for attorneys with a little risk tolerance and another for those with no risk tolerance. It's important to first note that for the purpose of compliance with Section 470, the argument you'd be making in support of using virtual law office as your New York office is that the virtual office has all the features of a traditional office, just purchased using a different economic arrangement. So generally, you want to make sure that your virtual office, in fact, functions like a working law office. So starting with the former, this is what we recommend a virtual office to have: a receptionist or staff to greet guests or handle pop-ins, a process for identifying priority deliveries and notifying the attorney, staff training on privilege and confidentiality, or a willingness to let the lawyer train the staff on these issues, private places to hold confidential meetings when needed, the availability of desk space, even if shared and even if floating, and a willingness to have someone serve as agent for service of process for when you're not there. Now, for more conservative attorneys, we've added three additional items, including a permanent desk space as opposed to a floating one, even if it's shared with others, a small amount of secure storage to leave behind, which can be a locking desk drawer, and signage. However, I wouldn't necessarily call a virtual office provider non-compliant for not meeting all three of those items. So let's take a look at what we've just learned and see if we can apply it to what's out there in the marketplace. So listen, this slide isn't meant to be a shill for my company, but it's here to contrast a fully compliant virtual law office with one that's not. Our company's virtual office program is fully compliant with the profiles we've just discussed, and as a bonus, because our office suites are limited to lawyers, the malpractice risk associated with sharing office space is minimized. On the left, you have what we call a cheap virtual office, which is little more than a post office box purchased from a private vendor. You can't have private meetings there, there's no desk space, they don't offer agent for service of process, secure storage, or signage, and you'd be hard-pressed to convince any regulator that this is a Section 470 compliant office, or that this is generally an office that's compliant with ethics rules. So we did a little research for you. Me and my staff secret shopped 5 additional virtual office vendors in New York City, and we rated them based only on their ethical compliance and not on the quality of their service, management, facility, or community. And here's what we found. Basically, the good news is that any well-run executive suite that sells virtual office packages, except for one, passed our compliant test. So for the top of the class here, the two on the right, ServCore and J Suites, had identical profiles. They had all of the requirements of the ethically compliant office, but they did not have the formal programs for training or service, but they were amenable to having an ad hoc arrangement. Neither had signage, and we rated both of them a B+. At Sage Workspaces, they were the only vendor that actually offered any kind of signage, and they were similar to the first two with respect to service and training. However, they didn't have dedicated floating day office space, meaning that if all their offices were rented to long-term tenants, there'd be the possibility there'd be no desk space available for virtual clients. Also, they only had one conference room at this location, which technically meets the requirement, but could be problematic for attorneys if all of the day office space was rented to long-term tenants. At the bottom of a class includes a vendor that we think probably shouldn't be there, and that's the City Bar's virtual office program. The City Bar was an outlier of sorts. They had stronger compliance than all the other vendors in terms of service and training, but where they were weak was reception. Their programs at the bar building, which if you've ever been there, is not an office suite like all the other vendors. It's confusing when you first go. Your first point of contact is a security guard that's very deep into the lobby, and it's up a small flight of stairs. We sent a secret shopper who had never been in the building before to try to best replicate what a client's experience may be. When our secret shopper finally found the guard and asked about our appointment for a virtual office tour, the guard looked a little befuddled, and it took several phone calls for him to find out why we were there. So you can imagine the confusion a client may have if they're in town and pop in to see their lawyer, who uses the space as their virtual office. Now, while this is technically staffed to greet in pop-ins, it barely meets the requirements that the City Bar's own ethics opinions on the subject describes. Other issues at the City Bar is that they only had one conference room, and the policy was that you had to reserve it 1 week in advance. The challenge here is that if you're making an argument that a virtual law office meets the definition of a Section 470 office because you get all the features of an office, but just on a different economic basis, it may be hard to make this argument at the City Bar. It's not an office. And while we did pass the City Bar on an ethics basis, we did rate it a C-. With respect to the last vendor, Corporate Suites, they automatically failed because they didn't have any program for service of process or training on attorney ethics requirements, and they also refused to allow any ad hoc arrangements. So one final note, with the exception of the City Bar, all of the vendors said in some form or other, hey, we service a lot of attorneys, so we know exactly what we're doing. But remember, there's a difference between what resident attorneys and non-resident attorneys may need from a virtual law office. The resident attorney can use their home, and the non-resident attorney has to rely on the virtual law office to be Section 470 compliant, and none of these vendors even knew that there was a difference. So the advice is, do your due diligence when you're shopping for a virtual office vendor. Ask a lot of questions before signing up. So that about wraps it up for me. 2 additional things. You can download this slide deck by going to lawfirmsuites.com/NYVLO. And if anyone wants to learn more about Law Firm Suites virtual office programs, check us out on our website at lawfirmsuites.com.